Hello, comic creators. Welcome to the post New York Comic Con, post No Kings Parade protest, pre Halloween episode of the Business of Comics podcast. We're going to start the show the way we always do. I'm going to start off with the major news of the past couple weeks. Then we're going to talk about the big story. Then we're going to open up the floor for questions. And then everybody can go back to making comics. So, amidst all of the hoopla and the crowds and the cosplay of New York Comic Con, there were two big stories on the business side, especially for independent and emerging creators. The first one is that there seems to be signs of life in the direct market. ICV2 and another media outlet, Prana Marketing, both posted stories or had presentations that showed that comic book sales are actually up in the direct market as of 2025. Comics Hub, a POS system used by some comic book shops, showed a 27% growth in 2025, and Manage Comics, another POS system used by different comic book shops, showed 18% growth. Now, if you are not familiar with what a POS system is, because you have not been blessed to work in retail, a POS system is basically a point of sale system. It is hardware and software used to actually track sales to consumers. Now, in the comic book industry, these numbers are important because we cannot rely on the orders that comic book shops make to publishers in order to determine sales. Because while those are actually sales to the publisher, because they are non-returnable in the direct market, those sales do not actually show how many units the comic book shop actually sold. The comic book shop could, for example, buy 100 copies of an issue of X-Men, sell 5 of them, and they still have 95 copies that they now have to put into back issues or in storage, even though they bought 95 issues. So the point of sale system is kind of used to be a more accurate determiner of how many people actually bought the comic once the comic book was published. Now, point of sales data like this is not 100% accurate because it only takes a sample of the overall comic shops. I believe both of these POS systems are sampling about 10 to 15% of the overall market. But because of the way comic book shop numbers work and because of the way comic book sales work, these are kind of the best numbers that we have to work with. So this is still good news. Now, this good news is actually explained by the fact that there are a lot of new publishing initiatives going on from companies like the Big Two. There's also a lot of anime, animation, and movie tie-in kind of activity that's bringing people in. And most importantly, it appears that Gen Z is actually finding their way into comic book shops. Now, I've said for a long time that if boomers and Gen X are the only people going to comic book shops and buying the books, then comic book shops are going to have a challenge in staying vital once all of us die off. But if Gen Z is starting to go into comic book shops, then you're going to have a replacement market. You're going to have new people coming in, buying comics, and increasing sales, which seems to be the case at least in 2025. This means if you are a independent or emerging creator and your book is targeted towards Gen Z, that is your market, then it makes sense to actually look at comic book shops as a viable distribution channel. But keep in mind that the distribution channel of the direct market is still in flux because of everything that's going on with Diamond. Now, the other big story of Comic-Con from a business standpoint was the statements that the Big Two made with regard to AI. Both Marvel and DC, their editors, their respective editors-in-chief in completely different events, made public statements that said neither company is using AI or will accept AI from their freelance talent in terms of making the books. Now, while this statement is going to be seen positively overall by the industry, there is still a question of detection and enforcement. Because right now, a lot of creators and a lot of readers are focusing on the idea of whether or not AI is being used to generate the artwork for certain books. But comic books are more than artwork. And I don't know if the editorial departments of either one of these companies or the readers of the comics can detect if AI was used to generate the script. Because as readers, we never see the script. So we don't know what it said or how it was made. The editors, they get the final word file, but do they know whether this script was made by AI or not? And I'm not an expert on AI, so I don't know if AI can be used for flatting, coloring, lettering. But if it can it be detected? And if it can't, then how will any of us know, especially as these systems become more sophisticated, how will any of us know whether or not AI is being used not just in the art, but in other aspects of the publication? Now, don't get me wrong, these statements that the companies don't want to use AI or not accepting AI is in line with a lot of what my clients are putting into their contracts in terms of not wanting AI to pollute the creative process. But because detection, especially in the underlying production materials, is still difficult, we need more than the statements. And it could be like a technological solution that the comic book industry and the rest of society has not figured out yet. So now that we've talked about the major news of the week, I'm going to go into today's commentary, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat. I will get to them in the order that I see them. Please keep in mind, this is not going to be legal advice because we have not generated an attorney-client relationship. But before we get into the questions, I want to actually talk about how comic creators go about making money in comics, because this is a Business of Comics podcast, so it makes sense to figure out how you can actually stay in business. So there are two major ways you can make money in comics. There's directly and indirectly. We're not going to talk about indirectly because indirectly is things like investment, things like licensing. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not in either one of those businesses. You're probably a creator, which means you're probably making money directly. If you're making money directly, there are three ways you can do it. You can make freelance, which means you don't own any of the intellectual property. You can work independently, which means you own all the intellectual property, or you can work in a creator-owned space where you may or may not own a piece of the intellectual property. Now, if you're working freelance, your primary method of getting paid is a page rate. For every page you produce, you get a certain amount of money. If you're working in a creator-owned space, your primary method of payment is either going to be an advance, which is the money that you're going to get in anticipation of a certain amount of books being sold, and royalties, the amount of money you're going to get if the advance earns out. Like if you sell more copies than they thought you were going to sell, you get royalties. If you're working in the independent space, then you get, the profit. You get the whatever's left over after you've paid all the bills for your comic. Now, if you understand those are the three ways that you can make money, the next question becomes, how is it that you can make a living in the comic book space? Now, when we're talking about making a living, the average personal income in the United States for 2024 is $45,000. So if you just break that down, if you're a freelance writer, you get $100 a page. That means you need to do 4,500 pages, which is about 20 books a year or about 2 books a month. Now, that may not seem like a lot because as a writer, you can write multiple books per month, but you still have to go out and get the deals from the publishers to do the work. You still have to figure out your pitches. You still have to chase people for money. You don't know unless you're on a long running book, and there are very few long running books in circulation now. Most books are limited series or maxi series or something like that. You're continually going to look for work, and when you're going to look for work, it's often feast or famine. So you don't know if you're going to have the 20 books you need to make that living. Now, to create your own space, you get it in advance. So if you get, let's say, $5,000 as an advance, which is basically you get $1 per book that they think they're going to sell, because the average new comic sells about 5,000 copies. That means you have to have 9 creator-owned books with under contract with publishers every single year to make that $45,000. Now, if you're in the creator-owned space, you know that it might take you years to get one creator-owned deal, much less get 9 of them every year to sustain a living as a creator-owned writer. Now, on the independent side, you have to actually make enough money with your book to pay for the book itself and the $45,000 that you need. So let's say for a graphic novel, it costs you all in $40,000. That's for the production cost for the final pages, printing, shipping, storage, everything else. That means your book, your graphic novel, would have to make $95,000 a year for you to actually earn a living in comics. Now, just to keep that in perspective, the average amount that a Kickstarter makes for a comic is about $18,000, which means you would have to make up the rest of that money in other channels, whether it's conventions or bookstore or direct market or direct to consumer or whatever. So as you can see, there is going to be a challenge, like in any form, working in any form of art, in making a living from comics. It is possible. And you have to keep in mind, these numbers are averages. Some people need a lot more money to live than $45,000. And if you are an artist or a colorist or a letterer, you're going to have different rates. The artist will be higher, the letterer and the colorist and the flatter will be significantly lower. So you're going to have to get more work to actually cover that amount. It is doable, but it is challenging. So now that we have looked at the economic realities of making comics, then let's see. Let's look at the questions and see what we've got. There's a lot of questions. Let's see. If my comic is based on real people or real events, how do I avoid legal trouble? Do I change names, add a disclaimer, or get written permission? Okay. You are now talking on a certain level about Okay. Somehow. Oh, look at that. I have been talking for about 15 minutes and my mic has been muted. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start all over again because, well, you probably need to hear the answers to my question to your questions. The question was, if I hired an artist as a work for hire, but I can't find the signed contract, how do I lock down ownership now? Will a new one-page confirming agreement plus my emails, invoices work? And what if the artist won't resign? Okay. If you can't find the print copy of the contract or the digital copy of the contract, and the artist, you can't find them or they're not around and they won't re-sign it, then hold on to your invoices, hold on to the emails, hold on to the versions of the contract that you have that were not signed, because what you're going to be showing is the course of business that will prove that you had a valid contract. So in many cases, you're going to only need to establish what's called chain of title if you're going to license this comic to someone else. Like you're going to make a movie, you're going to make a TV show, and they're going to want to know that you own the comic. The best way to have it is to get a statement from the artist that there was a contract, get them to send you a copy of the contract. That's the easiest way to do it. But if you can't do either one of those things, get all the documents that I just said, the drafts of the contract, the invoices, the emails that showed what you guys were doing, that showed there was in fact a valid contract. That's not going to be as good as the signed contract, but you'll get your work with what you got. Is there a difference? What is the legal difference between open source and public domain in comic book copyrights? Open source is not actually a concern in comics. Open source is more of a technological term that's used for software and applications and things like that. Public domain is all of those intellectual properties that are not being held by any one person or company. Anyone can use them. So like the early versions of Dracula or Winnie the Pooh or Sherlock Holmes or whatever, those are going to be in the public domain. Now you have to be very careful because like this year or last year, the first issue of Batman that came out in 1939 went into the public domain. But that does not mean Batman is in the public domain and you can do whatever you want with Batman. That's not how it works. It is only the first issue that's in the public domain. So you can only use the elements of the comic that were in that first issue. So for example, Joker, Robin, Catwoman, none of those people were in the first issue. Most of the character designs of Batman were not in that first issue. So you cannot, those things are not in the public domain. If you want to figure out if a particular comic or intellectual property is in the public domain, there is a website either run by Stanford or Cornell's copyright research project that you can go online, plug in the information, and see if the book is in the public domain. That's going to be your first step. Your second step is if this book, you think the book is in the public domain, go online and see if you could find a PDF of the actual comic. And then look at the copyright information in that comic, because every comic, every book is protected by copyright for a certain number of years, depending on when it was published and depending on whether the copyright was renewed. So in the 30s and the 40s, you'll have one set of copyright terms. In the 50s and the 60s, you'll have another set of copyright terms. So you have to figure out when the book was published and whether or not it is currently in the public domain. Just as a quick hint, if the book was published after 1978, it is not in the public domain and you cannot use it in that way because it is still protected by copyright. How many copyrights should be applied with ensemble characters for a single title run, such as a Fantastic Four? The magic thing about copyrights is that if you are copywriting a comic, you are going to get protection for all of the elements of that comic. So it's going to be the characters, the story, the things that they're using, the setting, everything else that is unique to that comic will be protected by copyright. You do not have to file a separate copyright for every individual element of the book. You do have to file a copyright for every individual issue of the book, but not every individual element of the book. The confusion comes in when people are confusing copyrights and trademarks. Your copyright is your ownership of the story itself and all the elements in the story. Your trademark are the words, the images, the sounds, the phrases that you're going to use to sell things like comics. So in your Fantastic Four example, you only have to get a copyright for issue number 1. But if you're going to use Fantastic Four as the name of something that you're going to use to sell comics, then you have to get a trademark in the Fantastic Four. You'd also have to get a trademark in Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman and Thing and Human Torch if you are going to sell things separately with each one of those characters, like t-shirts, posters, hats, whatever. But if your main focus is just on the comics and you're focusing on the copyrights of the comics, don't worry about filing a copyright for each individual element, because that's not how copyright works. What type of LLC does an independent comic book publisher need for participating in events at retail locations to sell their own books? Here's the thing. You could be a comic book creator and not have an LLC. You would be considered what is called a sole proprietor, which means that all of the debts and all the potential liability for you selling comics at a retailer to sell to retailers or to sell at conventions or to sell on your website, all of those liabilities would then go to you, which means if, let's say, you're at a convention and you're selling comics and your table tips over and crushes somebody's foot and they break their foot. If you're a sole proprietor, then the person whose foot you broke, who's going to sue you and the convention, will be able to sue you for everything you personally own. Bank accounts, real estate, everything. The convention will probably come after you too to cover their costs, but that's not the important part of the story. If you have an LLC and you follow all the procedures of having an LLC, which means you have a separate bank account, the LLC is a separate legal entity, then when your table flips over and falls on the guy's foot, that guy and the convention can only come after the assets of your company, which means the inventory of your comics, the profits from your comic book company, things like that. Your personal bank account, your house, your car would be safe. So you do not necessarily need to have an LLC, but I always recommend that any comic book creator who is going to do more than a one-shot comic should probably consider forming an LLC, both to protect themselves from the liability, and there are significant tax protections or tax write-offs that you can get from having an LLC that may be more difficult to have if you're a sole proprietor. And then we get all the messages that showed I was muted and didn't even know. I'm just rambling on. Let's see. Okay. Thank you for sticking around through that ridiculous audio issue. If there are no other questions, we are going to wrap it up for today. The next episode of the Business of Comics podcast will be on November 1st, which is a Saturday at 3 p.m. day after Halloween. Thank you, everybody, for joining. The clips of this will go online as they always do. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out and ask them to me. If you'd like to set up a free consultation to discuss the specific business or legal needs of your comic or your comic book publishing, please feel free to reach out. So until then, get off the internet and go make some comics.